Hello, welcome to the Artisan Woodshed. One of the questions I see asked quite a bit, either whether it's directly of me or in some of the very popular Facebook groups that are out there regarding learning how to do epoxy based, projects and things like that. There's a couple of really big ones out there that I happen to be active in, and really enjoy sharing and learning from other people. Encourage you to really check that out. But it's really, what are the types of epoxy that are available, and then what are the purposes and reasons for using them? Also, which is the best brand? Let's start out with which is the best brand. This is a question where we're opening up a Pandora's box. There are so many different epoxy manufacturers. Remember, this is a passion enjoyed by people all over the world. So some that you may find as an example in Europe are not going to be available possibly in America, and vice versa, or wherever you happen to live. So I think what you really want to do is look at maybe some history on certain ones. I've never really had bad results so far when used and handled properly with any of the particular epoxies that I've used. Here in front of you, I happen to have some examples of some upstart epoxy, both in tabletop as well as deep pour. But I'm looking straight across from me and behind the camera over there, and I see probably about 20 gallons of liquid glass, and I happen to enjoy using that epoxy quite a bit as well. So for me, it's kind of been between those two so far, simply because I've just had nothing but great luck with it. I hear a lot of great things about Total Boat, but the only thing you've got to watch with Total Boat is they make so many different types. And so some of those are meant for, hey, boats, and we're not making boats here. So understand that. Make sure you're getting the ones that are designed specifically for these types of projects, and really go out there and do that. But bottom line, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think I'd sweat it too much about which one is the best to use. I think it's more, how do I use it properly? A lot of areas where people have problems with, maybe their project's not turning out the way they'd hoped, oftentimes is a combination of some different things, and it's really not related to the epoxy manufacturer at all. And some of that is, these things, no matter these epoxies or any others, really need to be kept in room temperature. So if you're leaving them out in a climate, for example, in winter, you're leaving them out in your garage, not a good idea unless it's a temperature controlled space like mine is. I live in Central Florida, so I don't ever have to worry about them getting cold, but I do have to worry about it getting too hot. And if it gets too hot, that's a problem as well. So oftentimes, if it's too cold, you'll get a cloudy result, and that has nothing to do with the epoxy. It has to do with the temperature of that epoxy when it was used. So make sure you're storing your stuff in a temperature controlled space. Now, some of the other areas where people have problems is they don't mix it properly, and that is getting the ratio right. For most deep pours, it's a 2 to 1, 2 to 1, 2 to A and 1 to B. For most tabletop epoxies, it's gonna be a 1 to 1 ratio, and so it's really important that you get that right. You wanna make sure that you're using, a measuring, cup or bucket per se, that's really got great measurements on it where you can do that consistently. You really need to be as precise as possible. There's a lot of people out there that like to do it by weight. I don't think that personally is a good idea because the density of, especially between part A and part B, is much different. So I don't think weight alone is going to do it. I strongly encourage you to use a measuring cup like you were making a cake, okay? And so I encourage you to do that, but you wanna make sure that you get it properly, your ratios are proper. That's super, super important. And then depending on what you're doing, how you mix it is going to matter. If you're doing tabletop, you must, I repeat, you must be patient and mix that by hand. If you start using a drill and a whisk that's made from mixing, and we certainly use that for deep pour, but I'll talk about the pros and cons of that here in a second. If you do it you need to do it by hand. And typically most, you need to make sure you're following. I'm going to say most because I was getting ready to catch myself making a potential mistake. But as an example, with Upstart, they requires you mixing it for 3 minutes straight. Some of the others require a longer mix time. So you want to make sure you're looking up whatever brand of epoxy you're using and what the recommended mix time is for that when you're doing it. If you're mixing either by hand or with a whisk with a drill, you want to make sure that you're getting around the sides of that, especially when you're doing deep pour epoxy, because I said one is much thicker than the other and it will stick to the walls potentially of that cup. So you want to go around that cup or that bucket and go around it, but be careful. I can't begin to tell you that when you're using a drill and a whisk, set your drill to its lowest setting. Um, and when you're going around it, be careful. Make sure it's on a surface in case you pop a hole in that bucket. And I've been there, done that, and you've got a mess, mess, mess. So you want to avoid that. I promise you. I'm speaking from personal experience. So don't make that mistake. And so how you mix is going to be super important. So make sure you're doing your right ratio. You're doing it for the right amount of time. And if you're doing it for tabletop, mix by hand. If you're not doing that much volume, for example, these are small boards, but we do anything from these sizes up to the ones you see behind me up to, 6 foot tables. And so obviously, if we're doing the last table I did took 6 gallons of epoxy, well, I'm not mixing that by hand, let me tell you. But I didn't need to. One of the things that you get from mixing too much is kind of think about butter. If you're whipping butter as an example, right? When you get that whipped butter, you're getting air in it, right? You're developing air into that butter versus a solid piece of butter as an example. So kind of is the case when you're mixing epoxy, especially when you're doing it with a whisk and a drill. You want to avoid as much as you can, incorporating as much air as possible. Because what happens is that air eventually, once you pour it, goes to the top. And if you've done this already, you already know this, and you're going to get bubbles. All right. And so, where it's really a big problem is when you're doing tabletop, and all of these pieces that you see here have a tabletop on them. We don't do just tabletop. We do a lot where we do various different types of finishes, depending on what they're ultimately going to be used for. Um, but you want to avoid bubbles are a real big problem if you're doing tabletop. It can cause you to have to sand it down and do it over and over and over again. And my wife will actually show you some videos on how to apply tabletop properly because she does it better than I do. And that's a combination of stages. Doing a couple of seal coats and a flood coat for most things. But when you're doing deep pour, I personally don't worry about bubbles because I'm either going to plane them all off or I'm gonna slab mill them off. I simply just don't really care. I'll hit it once or twice with a torch when it comes out, but after that, I don't care because I'm gonna be taking all that off anyway. I don't sweat it. But if you do, you're getting a lot of air when you're using that drill and that whisk. Just understand that. And so a combination of getting your ratios right, mixing it the right way, whether it's mixing with a whisk and a drill with deep pour or by hand, if you're not doing that much volume, I still recommend doing that by hand. And if you're doing tabletop, you must do that by hand. Getting those things right are really going to matter. Making sure that your epoxy stored in the right temperature is also going to make a huge, huge difference. And then ultimately, a lot of areas, there's some other areas where you can get some fails that really aren't related to the epoxy. That's overusing too much mica powder. You use too much, you're going to have a lot of problems. And in the temperature of the place where it's curing also makes a difference. You want to check with the manufacturer of the particular resin that you're using, but most on average, really between 74 degrees and like 84, 86 degrees is optimal. What I do typically, when the shop's not being used here, I've got a Mr. Cool here in here that I actually put in about a month ago. It really made a huge difference for this particular shop. But I'll leave that set at 80, 81 most of the time when I'm not working in here and let things cure and I've not had a problem yet. So anyway, hopefully that explains some of the things. Again, I don't think I would sweat too much which brand, but understanding the differences. Now, again, the deep pour is exactly what what it stands for. It's for a deep pour, and that's typically anything like any of these boards or deeper. Now you'll find some, as an example, I'm looking back over there at Liquid Glass, and they say they make different ones. If you're doing like a 2 to 4 inch pour, then you're going to get a type of resin. If you're just doing something small like this, they have another type of resin. So you want to look into that and make sure you understand depending on how deep you're going. But for most projects like this, any deep pour is going to work for you. And then typically you have to make a decision whether you want to use a tabletop on top of it. A lot of people make the misunderstanding of thinking that a tabletop is going to protect it, and that's a mistake. It's not going to. It's going to provide better protection than an Odie's oil or a Aruba monocoat or something like that, but it's not going to give the protection that a polyurethane or something like that would, or something other options out there. So if you end up going with if you wanna put a tabletop on it, it's gonna make it look gorgeous at the end of the day. It's gonna look fantastic, and some of the advantages, for doing that over another type finish, is you get that glossy look. You don't have to spend as much time, sanding it, all the way up to wet sanding, potentially up to, 5,000 grit or something like that, or even further. You don't have to do that. You get a great look, and, if you wanna bring it back to new again, you just sand it down real quick and then do another coat. It's real simple, but you've got to make those decisions. But one last thing, remember, you look at these, never make the mistake of thinking that any of these are cutting boards. No, no, no. You never, ever, ever use resin for a cutting board. A charcuterie board, absolutely fine, but never for a cutting board. These things are food safe until you start cutting into them. And then you get the powder and everything in there, and then it's no bueno, baby. Don't do it. All right. So understand that. But for a charcuterie board, you can put food over this all day long and it works great. I have found personally Windex is the best thing for cleaning off the top of these, or some mild, warm, soapy water. But remember, when you do tabletop on this side, make sure you're doing some type of finish on the back side. And there's lots of options for that. You want to make sure that protects that from water and moisture. So hopefully this answers some basic fundamental questions about resin, how to make sure that you get the most out of whatever resin you end up buying so you have a successful pour and you've got a project you're proud of for many, many years to come. So thanks for watching. Do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, and really appreciate it. And bye-bye.